Mark had always dreamed of a quiet retreat where life moved at a slower pace. After years of working long shifts and saving every spare dollar, he finally purchased a property along a small lake on the edge of town. The land was peaceful, shaded by tall maples and oaks, with birds that sang in the early mornings and the gentle hum of crickets at night. For Mark, it felt like a little piece of paradise. At the edge of the lake sat a dam. It wasn't the towering structure one might imagine when hearing the word. Instead, it was a modest barrier of stone and concrete, built decades ago by the original developer to keep the water line steady and prevent flooding during heavy rains. Over the years, homeowners in the area had grown used to it being there. They fished from the edges, children played nearby, and the calm waters became the heart of the neighborhood. Mark knew the dam existed when he bought the property, but he never thought much about it. The realtor had mentioned it in passing, calling it a community feature that added charm to the lake. He assumed it was just another part of the landscape, like the trees, the shoreline, or the winding gravel road that led to the houses around the water. To him, it wasn't a matter of responsibility, but simply a feature of nature shaped by human hands. For the first few months, Mark enjoyed his new life without disturbance. He built a small deck overlooking the water, planted flowers along the path to his front door, and spent evenings watching the sun dip behind the tree line. Neighbors waved when they passed, and though he was still the newcomer, he felt optimistic about fitting in. It wasn't until a letter arrived in his mailbox one crisp morning that everything changed. The envelope bore the familiar logo of the Homeowners Association. Mark didn't think much of it at first. He assumed it might be a routine newsletter or perhaps a reminder about community events. But as he unfolded the pages, his brow furrowed. The letter wasn't about an event, nor was it a friendly welcome. Instead, it was an invoice, one that demanded a payment of $50,000. The explanation beneath the figure was short but startling. Assessment for dam maintenance and repair, payable in full by the property owner. Mark read the words again, sure that he had misunderstood. How could a single homeowner be expected to cover such a staggering amount? He sat at his kitchen table, the paper trembling slightly in his hands, reading every line of the letter. According to the association, the dam was located within the boundaries of his property. Because of that, the full cost of maintaining it had been assigned to him alone. He felt a wave of disbelief. The dam had always been described as part of the neighborhood, a shared feature that benefited everyone. It provided steady water levels for all the homes around the lake, not just his. The idea that he alone should bear the cost seemed beyond unreasonable. Later that day, Mark walked down to the dam and studied it with new eyes. Moss crept along the edges and the stone looked weathered but sturdy. It didn't appear to be in urgent need of repair. The idea that such a structure would suddenly require a fortune to maintain left him puzzled. If the association truly believed it needed work, why had they never raised the issue before? Why now, and why him? Mark spoke with a few neighbors over the next week, testing the waters carefully. Some seemed sympathetic but hesitant to get involved. Others avoided the subject altogether, their expressions tight with unease. The more he asked, the more he sensed a quiet tension in the air. It was as though no one dared to challenge the association openly. When he finally attended his first official meeting, the answer became clearer. The board members sat at a long table in the clubhouse, papers neatly stacked before them. At the center was the president, Hoakaren, a woman known for her commanding tone and meticulous attention to rules. When Mark raised the subject of the invoice, all eyes turned to him. Hoakaren tapped her folder, explaining that records showed the dam fell within the lines of his lot. She insisted that responsibility for its upkeep, including the newly proposed maintenance, belonged to him. She spoke with certainty, as though the matter was already settled. Mark tried to protest, explaining that the dam served everyone, not just him, but his words seemed to vanish into the air. Hoakaren's voice carried the weight of authority, and the other board members nodded in agreement. The meeting moved swiftly past his concerns, leaving him with more questions than answers. That night, Mark sat on his deck overlooking the still waters of the lake. The reflection of the moon shimmered across the surface, calm and beautiful, belying the storm that now brewed beneath the surface of his new life. He had sought peace in this place, But instead he had been handed a burden so heavy it threatened to undo everything he had worked for. And deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. The next week, Mark prepared carefully for the Homeowners Association meeting. He wasn't the type to cause a scene, but he knew he needed to speak clearly and ask the right questions. Carrying a folder of property documents and a notebook filled with his thoughts, he walked into the clubhouse with steady steps. The room was already filling with residents, chatting quietly as they found their seats. At the head of the room sat the board, with Karen presiding in her usual place at the center. She greeted everyone with a practiced smile, but when her eyes landed on Mark, the expression tightened ever so slightly. It was subtle, yet it gave him the impression that she already knew why he was there. As the meeting began, routine matters filled the agenda, reminders about lawn care, plans for a summer picnic, and budget updates. Mark waited patiently, jotting small notes in his notebook. When the floor was finally opened for questions, he raised his hand. "I'd like to discuss the invoice I received regarding the dam," he said in a calm, steady voice. A ripple of quiet moved through the room. Some residents shifted uncomfortably, while others glanced at each other with curiosity. Karen leaned forward, folding her hands. "Yes, mister," she replied. "That matter has already been documented. The dam lies within your property lines, so the responsibility for maintenance rests with you. The association has determined that the necessary work requires an assessment of $50,000. Mark opened his folder and held up a copy of his property survey. "With respect, the survey I received when I purchased the property doesn't show the dam as a private structure. It's considered part of the original development, serving the entire lake. If it benefits every home here, why should the full cost fall to me?" Karen's expression remained composed, though her eyes narrowed slightly. "Because it is located on your land," she repeated. "The survey you mention may not reflect the updated records we've obtained. Our position is firm. It is your obligation, and the association will enforce it if necessary." Her words carried a finality that left little room for debate. Yet Mark pressed on, his voice polite but unwavering. "May I see these updated records?" For a moment, Karen hesitated. Then she lifted a folder and tapped it lightly. "The documents are for board review, but the conclusion has already been reached. You may submit a written request if you wish, but it will not change the outcome." The room grew tense. A few residents looked down at their laps, unwilling to meet Mark's eyes. Others whispered quietly, though their voices never rose loud enough for him to catch the words. He realized then that this wasn't just about a dam. It was about authority, about rules, and about the quiet pressure that held the neighborhood in place. Still, he refused to give in. "With respect, I won't accept an invoice of this size without full transparency. If the dam truly requires maintenance, then surely there should be open discussion about how it's handled, especially since the entire community benefits from it." Karen's polite smile returned, though it seemed sharper now. "Mister, I understand your concerns, but the board has made its decision. If the invoice is not paid in full by the deadline, late fees will be applied. Continued non-payment may result in further action." The words hung in the air like a quiet warning. Mark felt the weight of every gaze in the room. He knew many of his neighbors agreed with him in their hearts, but none were willing to speak aloud. The meeting quickly moved on, shifting to lighter topics as if nothing significant had been said. When it finally ended, Mark lingered outside the clubhouse, hoping someone might approach him. A few offered sympathetic smiles as they passed, but no one stopped to talk. It was as though invisible walls surrounded each homeowner, keeping them from stepping into the conflict. Walking home beneath the glow of Mark felt a mixture of frustration and determination. He had moved to the lakeside for peace, not disputes, yet he couldn't allow this demand to stand unchallenged. The letter, the invoice, and now the meeting had made one thing clear: the association would not back down. He sat on his porch that night, the crickets filling the silence as he looked out at the calm lake. The dam stretched across the water like a shadowed guardian, steady and silent. To most, it was a forgotten structure, a backdrop to their daily lives. But for Mark, it had suddenly become the center of a storm. He didn't know exactly how he would fight the decision, but he knew he couldn't surrender to it. The path ahead would be difficult, but something deep within him refused to accept an injustice so large. The lake was still, but Mark could sense the currents beginning to shift beneath the surface. The days following the meeting left Mark in a restless state. He spent long evenings at his kitchen table, papers spread across the surface as he tried to piece together the truth. Property maps, county records, and copies of old surveys filled neat stacks. Each document painted the same picture. The dam had always been part of the original development, not a private structure belonging to one household. Despite the evidence he collected, another letter arrived in his mailbox. The tone was even firmer than before. "Notice of non-payment," it read, with a list of added fees. The amount now exceeded $51,000, and the letter ended with a warning that further action could include a lien on his home. Mark set the letter down and took a deep breath. He wasn't easily shaken, but the pressure was beginning to build. He had worked too hard for this place, and the thought of losing it over a claim that made little sense was unbearable. Determined to take the next step, Mark contacted a local attorney named David, who specialized in property law. Sitting across from David in a small office lined with law books, Mark laid out the situation. He showed him the invoices, the surveys, and the notes he had taken at the meeting. David listened carefully, leaning back in his chair with thoughtful eyes. "From what you've shown me, this case looks questionable at best. The association has authority, but it's not unlimited. If the dam truly benefits every household, then assigning the entire cost to you seems unreasonable. The key will be proving the dam's history and its intended use." Relief washed over Mark as he realized he wasn't alone in this fight. With David's guidance, he filed a formal request to review the association's records, specifically those that Karen had referenced at the meeting. The request was polite and professional, yet it was met with silence. Weeks passed without a reply. Instead, Mark received another notice, this one marked "Final Warning." The message was clear. The board had no intention of cooperating. At the same time, subtle obstacles began to appear in Mark's daily life. One afternoon, a guest he had invited to his home called from the entrance gate, saying they had been turned away because their name wasn't on the approved visitor list. Another day, Mark returned from work to find a notice taped to his door citing him for unapproved decorative plants near his porch. Though small, these actions carried an unmistakable pattern. Mark kept calm, documenting everything. Each paper, each notice, each restriction went into a growing binder. He knew that losing his temper would only play into the association's favor. Instead, he focused on building a record that could speak for itself. The more he observed, the more he noticed the quiet unease of his neighbors. Some would stop briefly to chat as they passed, lowering their voices when they mentioned the dam. "It's not fair what they're doing," one neighbor whispered, glancing around nervously before walking on. Another shook his head and muttered, "They've been strict before, but this is different." Though their words gave him comfort, none were willing to stand beside him publicly. Mark couldn't blame them. Challenging the board carried risks, and not everyone had the energy or the means to face them. Meanwhile, Karen's voice carried louder at each meeting. She spoke of standards and accountability, framing the issue as one of simple responsibility. To the casual listener, it might have sounded reasonable. But to Mark, it was clear that her determination had less to do with fairness and more to do with maintaining control. One evening, Mark sat by the lake with his binder open on his lap. The pages rustled in the breeze as he looked across the water at the dam. Its presence was quiet and steady, yet in his mind it had become a symbol of something larger, of boundaries, of burdens, and of the question of what truly belonged to him. He thought of his father's words, spoken years ago when he had faced a challenge at work. "The harder the push, the stronger the stand." Mark felt those words echo within him now. The association could apply pressure, but he would not yield, not without truth, not without proof. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the lake in shades of gold and violet, Mark made a silent vow. He would fight with patience, with persistence, and with every tool available to him. The association might expect him to give in quietly, but they were mistaken. The conflict had moved beyond a single invoice. It had become a test of principle, and Mark was prepared to see it through to the very end. The following month brought a shift in the neighborhood's mood. The issue of the dam was no longer confined to letters and board meetings. It had become the quiet topic of conversation on porches, in driveways, and during evening walks. Though no one spoke loudly about it, the subject surfaced in hushed tones, always followed by careful glances over shoulders. Mark noticed the change most clearly at the local where some residents gathered each morning. The group that once exchanged cheerful greetings now spoke in cautious fragments. When Mark entered, the air grew still for a moment, then returned to soft chatter. Occasionally, someone offered him a sympathetic nod, but their words rarely rose above a whisper. It was as though invisible lines had been drawn, dividing the community between silence and support. One evening, Mark received a knock on his door. Standing outside was Henry Collins, one of the neighborhood's oldest residents. Henry's posture was stooped with age, but his voice carried strength. "May I come in for a few minutes?" he asked. Mark welcomed him inside and poured 2 glasses of iced tea. Henry settled into a chair by the window and looked out toward the lake. "I've lived here since the first houses were built," he said slowly. "I remember when that dam was constructed. It wasn't meant to belong to any one person. The developer put it in place so the lake would remain steady for all of us." Relief washed over Mark as he listened. Then the claim that it's my responsibility doesn't make sense. Henry nodded. "It doesn't. The paperwork may have shifted over the years, but the intent was always clear. Everyone benefits from that dam. Everyone should share the responsibility." Henry's words strengthened Mark's resolve, yet the visit also reminded him of how few were willing to speak openly. After all, Henry was nearing the end of his time in the neighborhood and had little to lose. Others still felt bound by the weight of the association's authority. The tension reached a new height during the next homeowners' meeting. Chairs filled quickly, and the air carried a charge of anticipation. Corinne sat at the center of the board table, her notes arranged in a neat stack. When the agenda turned to financial matters, she spoke with her usual poise. "As you are all aware," she began, "the matter of the dam has been addressed by the board. The property owner has been of his obligation, and we expect payment in accordance with our policies." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Mark rose from his seat and held his binder firmly in his hands. "With respect," he said clearly, "I have gathered records that show the dam was intended as a shared structure. I've requested access to the association's documents, but my requests have been ignored. If this matter affects the whole community, shouldn't the whole community have the right to see the truth?" The room fell quiet. For a moment it seemed as though someone might speak up in agreement. But then Corinne's calm voice cut through the silence. "Mister, this meeting is not the place for disputes. The board has made its decision. If you disagree, you may pursue other avenues. For now, we will continue with the agenda." The words hung in the air, and one by one, heads lowered. The conversation shifted to lighter topics, yet the tension never fully eased. Afterward, as residents filed out, a few lingered near Mark. A woman named touched his arm gently and whispered, "You're right. Many of us know it, but people are afraid of what might happen if they say it out loud." Her voice trembled slightly as she glanced toward the board members still gathered at the front. Mark nodded, grateful for her honesty. "Thank you, that means more than you know." Walking home beneath the glow of porch lights, Mark realized the conflict had grown beyond a personal battle. The dam had become a symbol, not just of property lines, but of how power shaped the lives of everyone around the lake. Some neighbors wanted change, but hesitated to risk the stability they had. Others stayed quiet, unsure of what to believe. That night, sitting on his porch with the binder in his lap, Mark studied the moon's reflection across the water. He understood now that the struggle was no longer his alone. Whether or not his neighbors were ready to admit it, the dam represented a question they all shared. How much authority should one board hold over the lives of many? Mark closed the binder with a steady hand. The community might be divided, but he knew where he stood. The path forward would not be easy, yet the truth was too important to leave hidden. And if it meant carrying the weight a little longer, he was prepared. The weeks that followed brought subtle but unmistakable pressure. The Homeowners Association did not openly confront Mark, but the restrictions began to accumulate in ways that made daily life increasingly complicated. Notices appeared on his door for minor things like landscaping adjustments or exterior maintenance. His driveway, usually quiet, was occasionally blocked by temporary equipment or parked vehicles, forcing him to reroute visitors and deliveries. Mark documented every incident. Each note, each photo, each written warning went into his growing binder. He maintained calmness in every interaction, knowing that reacting with anger or frustration could undermine his position. Yet he could feel the persistent tug of tension. The association had a rhythm now, and he was determined not to be pulled off course. One afternoon, as he walked along the lakeside, he noticed a small gathering of board members near the dam. Karen was speaking in measured tones, holding what appeared to be another set of documents. Though he could not hear every word, her gestures and the nodding of others suggested discussion of plans or strategies. The air carried a sense of controlled determination, a quiet warning that they intended to maintain their authority. Rather than reacting hastily, Mark decided to observe carefully. He returned home and reviewed old surveys, photographs, and maps, noting the placement of every boundary line, the history of maintenance, and the original intentions of the developer. His research revealed an interesting pattern. Over the years, references to shared responsibilities had been overlooked or omitted in updates to the HOA's records. The dam, while located near his property, had always been recognized as serving the entire lake. Mark realized the situation was reaching a tipping point. He could continue to endure the small pressures, the notices, the minor inconveniences. But if he wanted resolution, he needed a strategy that addressed the underlying issue. He scheduled another meeting with his attorney, David, to discuss the next steps. David listened as Mark recounted the ongoing subtle pressures and shared the research he had gathered. "It's clear the association is applying influence in ways that are inconvenient but not illegal," David noted. "That gives you leverage, because any significant action must be justified by law or policy. Right now, they're pushing the limits without crossing legal lines, which means you have the opportunity to act thoughtfully and strategically." With a plan forming, Mark decided to communicate directly with the board. He drafted a letter outlining the historical evidence of the dam's shared role, the benefits it provided to the entire community, and his request for a reasonable resolution. He made sure the tone remained professional and factual, emphasizing cooperation rather than conflict. The letter was delivered to the board members the following day. Within hours, Mark noticed a subtle shift. While Karen and her team did not respond immediately, there was a new tension in the air when neighbors passed by. Some offered encouraging glances, as if silently acknowledging that Mark had taken a careful stand. Others continued their quiet routines, watching and waiting. Despite the careful tone of his letter, the association maintained their stance publicly. Another meeting was scheduled, and Karen spoke with her usual clarity, emphasizing responsibility and adherence to policy. Yet Mark's preparations allowed him to present a calm, factual argument. He referenced historical documents, surveys, and even notes from long-time residents, all of which supported his claim that the dam's maintenance had historically been a shared responsibility. The room felt charged, though no voices rose in anger. Neighbors leaned forward subtly, listening more attentively than before. The balance of authority seemed to shift slightly, though the board maintained their composed front. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that neither side would yield quickly. The association's strategy had been to apply incremental pressure, hoping Mark would relent. Instead, he had responded with thorough preparation and careful documentation. What began as subtle pressure had now transformed into a quiet standoff, a test of patience, resilience, and principle. Mark returned home that evening, watching the sun glint off the lake's surface. The dam stretched across the water, steady and silent, yet its presence had taken on new meaning. It was no longer just a structure of stone and water. It had become a symbol of responsibility, fairness, and the challenge of standing firm in the face of persistent pressure. He opened his binder once more, reviewing every note, every photo, every documented interaction. The association had tested him in small ways, but he had responded with calm determination. The conflict had evolved beyond invoices and notices. It was now a question of principle and persistence. Mark leaned back in his chair, taking a deep breath. He knew the coming weeks would be crucial. The board had escalated their efforts, but he was ready. With careful planning, patience, and a clear understanding of the facts, he would meet every challenge thoughtfully. And deep down, he sensed that the next phase of the conflict would require a decision unlike any he had made before. Mark spent the following days deep in research, poring over historical records, property maps, and old county documents. Every evening, he sat by the lake with his binder open on his lap, the water reflecting the moonlight like a quiet mirror to his thoughts. He had already prepared for confrontation with careful documentation, but he now felt that a more decisive strategy was necessary. One afternoon, while reviewing deeds and boundary surveys at the county office, Mark stumbled upon a set of historical records that changed everything. Among the older developer notes and property plans, he found a clear statement. The dam was constructed on his parcel, but it was intended for the benefit of all homeowners around the lake. Even more importantly, the document stated that the owner of the parcel could make decisions about the dam, provided it did not obstruct or damage the properties of others. Mark leaned back in his chair, reading the words again and again. The discovery struck him like a lightning bolt. The HOA could insist he was responsible, but the legal documents gave him rights over the structure itself. He had the authority to make decisions regarding the dam, including its maintenance, alteration, or removal. Returning home, Mark felt a rush of clarity. The situation had shifted. What the association considered a burden could now be transformed into an opportunity. If the board wanted control and responsibility, he had the legal right to determine how the dam would be handled. The thought sparked a mix of excitement and cautious planning. That evening he walked along the shoreline, the cool water lapping at his boots. He examined the dam carefully, taking note of its construction and current condition. It was solid enough to have stood for decades, yet manageable if a deliberate plan was put in place. Mark considered the possibilities. Rather than continuing to accept the association's incremental pressures, he could take an action that was within his rights and also served as a decisive statement. Before taking any steps, he consulted his attorney, David. "David, I found the original records," Mark said, spreading them across the table. "They clearly state that the dam is on my property and I have the right to manage it as long as I avoid damage to neighboring properties. This gives me a legal advantage. What can I do?" David leaned back, studying the documents. "The law is on your side here. You can decide to maintain it, improve it, or remove it entirely. Any action you take must remain within reason, but it does give you leverage. The association can't force you to pay $50,000 for maintenance if you are legally entitled to control over the structure." Mark nodded, the weight of the revelation sinking in. He now had an edge. The board had been pressing him, assuming he would give in under financial and social pressure. Instead, he held the key to the next phase of the conflict, a lawful, deliberate decision that could change the course of the dispute entirely. Over the next few days, Mark devised a careful plan. He would act decisively but not recklessly. He could remove the dam, effectively neutralizing the association's claim of financial responsibility, but he needed to ensure it was done safely and in a way that respected the environment and neighboring properties. Every step would be documented. Every action would be lawful and controlled. He began consulting with engineers and contractors, discussing the safest way to modify the dam. His approach was meticulous, taking into account water flow, soil stability, and the protection of nearby properties. Nothing would be left to chance. Every measure was carefully planned, every risk assessed. As Mark sat by the lake one evening, watching the water reflect the setting sun, he felt a sense of calm determination. The turning point had arrived. The burden that the association had attempted to impose was no longer a threat. Instead, it had become an opportunity to assert his rights, make a decisive choice, and set the stage for a resolution. He smiled faintly to himself, thinking of the next meeting with the board. They expected resistance, confusion, and perhaps concession. What they did not expect was a calm, measured response rooted in knowledge, preparation, and lawful authority. The scales had shifted. The lake remained quiet, the dam standing firm, but Mark knew that in a matter of days, Everything about the water line, the structure, and the association's assumptions would be challenged. And for the first time in weeks, he felt the thrill of possibility. Mark's mind was clear. The conflict had moved from frustration to strategy. The next step would require courage, precision, and patience. But for the first time, he felt fully in control. The morning was quiet, the lake reflecting the soft glow of dawn as if unaware of the storm that was about to unfold. Mark arrived at the dam early, clipboard and plans in hand, ready to supervise the carefully coordinated work he had scheduled. The contractors were already in position, assessing the structure and preparing the necessary equipment. Every step had been calculated, every precaution accounted for. Word had quietly spread through the neighborhood that Mark intended to take decisive action regarding the dam. Some residents watched from a distance, curious yet unsure how the day would unfold. A few stopped by to offer words of encouragement, their voices low and filled with cautious optimism. The tension in the air was palpable, yet there was no malice, only anticipation of the first visible step in a long-standing dispute. As the work began, the first section of the dam was carefully removed under Mark's supervision. Stones and timber were dismantled methodically, ensuring that water flow would remain controlled and that no nearby properties would be harmed. Mark observed each step, coordinating with the contractors to maintain both safety and efficiency. It wasn't long before Karen arrived, accompanied by a few board members. Their faces were composed, yet there was an unmistakable air of apprehension. They had been aware of Mark's legal rights, but had hoped he would hesitate or compromise. Seeing him take action without hesitation challenged their expectations. "Mr. Karen said, her tone calm but firm. "What exactly is happening here?" Mark walked toward her, pointing to the carefully managed removal. "The dam is on my property as confirmed by the original records. I am exercising my right to manage it responsibly. The structure will be modified in a way that is safe, controlled, and fully documented. This addresses the concerns of maintenance, and it clarifies the responsibilities going forward." Karen's expression flickered for a moment, a mix of surprise and calculation passing across her face. "You understand that this changes the water level for the entire neighborhood," she said, carefully choosing her words. "I do," Mark replied. "That's why we are proceeding gradually, ensuring no property is negatively affected. The goal is not conflict, it's clarity. The work is lawful, safe, and managed to protect everyone's interests." For several tense moments, no one spoke. Neighbors watched quietly, their attention fixed on the unfolding scene. Karen consulted with her board members, whispering briefly before looking back at Mark. She nodded slowly, acknowledging the legality and care of his approach. Though she clearly disagreed with his decision, there was nothing in the law that allowed her to stop him. As the sun climbed higher, the dam's central section was carefully dismantled, and water began to flow more freely across the lake. The sound of moving water replaced the stillness, gentle at first, then steady. Mark watched attentively, ensuring the flow remained controlled, that soil and surrounding land were protected. The lake's surface began to ripple, reflecting light like scattered diamonds across the landscape. The work continued smoothly throughout the day. Karen and her team observed without interference, realizing that Mark's meticulous planning left no grounds for objection. Slowly, the mood shifted. Some residents who had been hesitant began to nod in approval, recognizing that Mark's actions were responsible and measured. By late afternoon, the final adjustments were complete. The dam had been modified safely, the water level balanced, and the structure secured. Mark stood at the edge of the lake, surveying the scene. The conflict that had loomed for months now had a visible resolution, clear and lawful, and achieved without incident. Karen approached him once more. "I see that you have planned this carefully," she admitted, her tone more neutral than before. "While I may not agree with your decision, I cannot dispute that it was handled responsibly and within your rights." Mark nodded, his expression calm. The goal was never to create conflict, only to address the responsibility fairly and safely. I hope this clarifies the situation for everyone involved. The board members departed, and neighbors began to gather along the shoreline, quietly commenting on the careful execution of the work. Some offered congratulations, Others simply observed, but all recognized the fairness and thoughtfulness that had guided the day's actions. As evening approached, Mark sat on the deck he had built overlooking the lake. The water shimmered in the fading light, steady and serene. The dam had been modified responsibly, the neighborhood's properties were protected, and the long-standing tension had finally begun to resolve. For Mark, it was a moment of quiet triumph, not through confrontation or conflict, but through knowledge, preparation, and measured action. The lake remained calm, a mirror of the sky above, and for the first time in months, Mark felt a sense of peace. The showdown had passed. The principles he had stood for, responsibility, fairness, and careful planning, had carried the day. The morning after the work on the dam, the neighborhood felt different. There was a quiet energy in the air, a subtle acknowledgement that something important had shifted. Mark walked along the shoreline, observing the calm waters as they reflected the early sunlight. The dam had been modified carefully, the water level balanced, and the shoreline remained intact. It was a testament to careful planning, patience, and a steady hand. As he approached the lake, he saw neighbors beginning to gather. Some walked slowly along the gravel paths, others paused at their driveways, and a few stood on their porches. Their expressions carried curiosity and relief, a mix of admiration for the work completed and appreciation for the care taken. Over time, small conversations began to ripple through the crowd. People exchanged observations about the controlled water flow, the thoughtful approach to the modification, and the fact that no properties had been harmed. Henry Collins, the longtime resident who had once shared the history of the dam with Mark, walked alongside him. "I've lived here for over 40 years, he said, his voice steady and warm. "I've seen many things, but today stands out. You acted with care, patience, and fairness. This is the way challenges should be handled." Mark smiled, feeling a quiet satisfaction. "I only wanted to do what was right for everyone while also respecting the rules and the property. That's always been the goal." Even Karen, who had presided over the board meetings and insisted on the original invoice, approached with a composed demeanor. "Mister," she said, her tone measured, "I see that you acted responsibly and with full awareness of the situation. While I may have disagreed with your methods at first, I cannot deny the careful consideration behind every step you took." Mark nodded politely. "Thank you. I hope this sets a precedent for handling matters like this in the future. Clarity and fairness should guide every decision." Throughout the day, neighbors continued to examine the lake and the dam. Some walked along the shoreline, noting how the water flowed steadily and evenly. Others stood in quiet conversation, acknowledging the careful planning that had prevented disruption or damage. The sense of community, once tinged with uncertainty and quiet tension, had softened into a shared understanding that responsible action could resolve difficult situations. In the weeks that followed, the Homeowners Association adjusted its approach. The board reviewed Mark's documentation and historical records, ultimately acknowledging the shared nature of the dam and revising their policies to prevent similar misunderstandings in the future. Notices of responsibility for maintenance were updated to reflect accurate historical facts, and future discussions about shared structures became more transparent and cooperative. Mark, meanwhile, continued his life by the lake. He spent mornings on the deck, sipping coffee and watching the sun rise over the calm water. Evenings were filled with quiet reflection, reading by the shore or taking walks along the gravel paths. The dam, once a source of stress and tension, now symbolized clarity, responsibility, and the value of measured, lawful action. Neighbors occasionally stopped by to express their appreciation, sharing stories about how the resolution had given them confidence to approach future issues with patience and preparation. Children played safely along the water's edge, couples walked their dogs, and the quiet hum of daily life returned to its peaceful rhythm. Mark's experience became a subtle lesson for the neighborhood. People realized that standing firm, documenting facts carefully, and addressing challenges thoughtfully could prevent escalation and produce fair results. It was a reminder that even in moments of pressure, calm, deliberate action often yielded the best outcomes. As the sun dipped behind the trees one evening, painting the lake in hues of gold and amber, Mark sat on his deck and looked out at the shimmering water. The dam stood modified but stable, the lake calm and steady. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not because he had won a conflict, but because he had acted responsibly, upheld his principles, and brought clarity to a situation that had once seemed overwhelming. The neighborhood had witnessed the outcome, learned from it, and moved forward. Mark knew that the challenges he had faced would remain a memory, but also a reminder that thoughtful action, preparation, and calm determination could turn even the most complex situation into an opportunity for resolution. With a gentle breeze brushing across the water and the distant sounds of life continuing along the lake, Mark closed his eyes for a moment and breathed in deeply. The conflict was over. Peace had returned, and for the first time in months, everything felt exactly as it should. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next mystery on HOA Hunter Stories.